Hello there, my friends. I hope this day finds you safe, warm, and in good spirits. How is the weather treating you in your part of the world tonight? You know, as we journey through life, we often look back at the doors we closed and wonder if we can ever truly go home again. Why is it that we humans are so quick to walk away when things get difficult, while the animals we care for are the ones who refuse to let go? Today, we travel to a silent, boarded-up house in the heart of Ohio, where a loyal cat named Rusty teaches us that true love means standing your ground, even when the rest of the world has moved on. If you appreciate stories that touch the soul, I invite you to join our fearless Paws family by tapping the subscribe button. We have saved a warm seat by the fire just for you. The November wind in Youngstown, Ohio, has a way of cutting right through a winter coat. It carries the scent of damp earth and the faint, ghostly metallic smell of the old steel mills that line the Mahoning River. For most people, it was weather to stay indoors. But for 80-year-old Joe and his orange tabby cat, Rusty, the front porch of the old Craftsman house on Elm Street was the only place to be. Joe sat in his heavy oak rocking chair, a blanket tucked around his knees. The wood of the chair groaned softly as he rocked back and forth, a rhythm that had measured out the evenings of his life for 40 years. Rusty, a large ginger cat with a nick in his left ear, sat perched on the railing, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. He looked less like a pet and more like a sentry, guarding the perimeter with his golden eyes. "Do you remember the heat of the blast furnaces in 1978, Rusty?" Joe asked, his voice rough like gravel but warm. "We worked double shifts back then. The noise was so loud, you could feel it in your teeth." Rusty blinked slowly, offering a soft purr that vibrated in his chest, acknowledging the old man's story. To anyone else, Joe was just talking to a cat. But Joe knew better. Rusty was his colleague, his confidant, and the only other living soul who understood the quiet dignity of this house. As the streetlights flickered on, signaling the coming night, Joe tapped his knee. "Come on, partner. Time for the inspection." They moved inside, the warmth of the living room embracing them. This was their favorite game. Joe shuffled toward the stone fireplace, where the floorboards were worn smooth by generations of footsteps. He knelt down with a grunt of effort and pried up a loose piece of oak trim near the hearth. From his pocket, he produced a small, dry butter biscuit and placed it into the dark cavity beneath the floor. "Find it, Rusty," Joe whispered. The cat pounced, pawing at the wood, his claws making a rhythmic scratching sound against the grain until he retrieved his prize. It was a simple ritual, but it was theirs. Joe watched him eat, then reached back into that same hiding spot. This time, his hand brushed against a cold metal tin box. He did not pull it out, but he knew exactly what was inside. There were envelopes that had never been mailed, and fresh tickets for the Cleveland Guardians baseball team for the upcoming season. He bought a pair every single year. "Maybe this year," he murmured to the empty room. "Maybe this summer, Sarah will finally come home to use the other ticket." Rusty finished his treat and looked up at Joe, head tilted, as if he understood that the biscuit was just a game, but the box was a prayer. The house was warm, and the fire was bright, but the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of someone who was missing. The peace of that November evening was shattered, not by a storm, but by the hollow sound of a ceramic mug striking the wooden floorboards of the porch. It broke into sharp fragments, spilling lukewarm coffee across the painted gray wood. Joe gasped, his hand clutching at his chest, and then slumped forward. The heavy oak rocking chair pitched violently to the side and tipped over with a deafening crash that echoed down the quiet street. Rusty, who had been dozing on the railing, leaped down in a panic. He circled the fallen man, his tail puffed out in alarm. He nudged Joe's hand with his wet nose, letting out a low, questioning meow. But the hand that always offered warmth and scratches lay still on the cold wood. Minutes later, the darkness was sliced open by the rotating red and blue lights of an ambulance. The vehicle shrieked to a halt in front of the house. Strangers in uniforms rushed up the walkway, their heavy boots thumping against the steps. In the chaos of shouting voices and clattering equipment, a heavy boot accidentally kicked the already overturned rocking chair, sliding it further into the corner. Rusty, terrified by the commotion, darted under the overgrown hydrangea bushes near the foundation. He watched with wide, fearful eyes as the strangers lifted Joe onto a stretcher and wheeled him away. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a finality that made Rusty flinch. Then, the siren wailed into the distance, fading until the only sound left was the wind rustling the dry leaves. Rusty emerged from the bushes and sat on the empty porch. He waited. He waited for the car to return, for the heavy tread of Joe's boots, for the creak of the door. But the house remained silent. 2 days later, a white van pulled up. It was not Joe. 2 men in coveralls got out, carrying large sheets of plywood and power tools. Sarah, overwhelmed by the phone call from the hospital and stuck in her high-rise office in Chicago, had made the difficult decision to secure the property. She could not come home yet, and she feared vandals would target the empty house in this declining neighborhood. The sharp, grinding noise of drills filled the air. One by one, the eyes of the house were closed. Thick plywood was screwed over the windows and the front door, sealing the memories inside into darkness. When the men left, the house looked like a blind fortress. Rusty was locked out, a small orange speck against a wall of gray timber. The first snow of December began to fall that night, dusting Rusty's fur with white powder. He shivered violently. Instinct took over, guiding him to the side of the house where an old iron door led to a coal chute, a relic from when the house was built in 1925. The chute was cramped and smelled of ancient dust. But deep inside, near the foundation, the old steam pipes that ran from the basement still radiated a faint, life-saving warmth. This became his bunker. But every night, Rusty would crawl out of the chute and return to the porch. The heavy oak rocking chair still lay on its side, exactly where it had fallen, looking wrong and broken in the moonlight. Rusty would approach it and press his forehead against the wood, pushing with all his might. He would nudge it repeatedly, his paws slipping on the icy floor, trying to force the heavy object to stand upright. In his feline mind, the world had tipped over when the chair fell. He believed that if he could just get the chair to stand up again, perhaps the door would open, the lights would turn on, and his friend would come home. A week later, a silver rental car with Illinois license plates navigated the potholes of Elm Street, looking starkly out of place against the backdrop of fading siding and rusted chain-link fences. Sarah stepped out of the vehicle, pulling her tailored wool coat tighter against the biting wind. She took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar metallic scent of the Mahoning Valley, a smell she had spent 10 years trying to scrub from her memory. She stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the house. Covered in plywood sheets, it looked like a tomb. It was an eyesore, a problem to be solved, a line item on a spreadsheet that she needed to clear before returning to her busy life in Chicago. The guilt of leaving her grandfather alone here for so long was a dull ache in her chest, but she pushed it down, focusing on the logistics of estate agents and nursing homes. Then she saw him. Sitting on the cracked concrete of the walkway, completely motionless, was Rusty. He was no longer the sleek, well-fed companion she remembered from photos Joe had sent. His orange fur was matted with grime and burrs, and his frame was skeletal, his ribs visible even through his winter coat. He did not turn to greet her. He did not run away. He simply sat there, staring with an unnerving intensity at the plywood sheet covering the living room window. "Rusty?" Sarah called out softly. The cat did not twitch. It was as if he were carved from stone. Sarah approached him slowly, her heart sinking at his condition. She crouched down and reached out to pick him up, intending to put him in the warm car and take him to a shelter. As her leather gloves wrapped around his torso, she felt him stiffen. She lifted him, and his paws pressed against her bare wrist where her glove ended. She pulled back, startled by the sensation. His paws were wet. Sarah frowned, looking at the dry, frozen pavement. There was no snow melting here, and no puddles. She touched the pads of his feet again. They were damp and cold. A memory from a biology class years ago surfaced in her mind. Cats do not sweat like humans. They sweat through their paws, and usually only when they are in a state of terror. She looked down at the small animal in her arms. Despite the freezing temperature of the Ohio winter, Rusty was sweating. He was not just cold, he was terrified. He was living in a state of constant, high-alert anxiety, fighting every survival instinct that told him to flee to a warmer place. He was fighting his own biology to stay right here. Sarah set him back down, unable to hold the weight of his fear. Rusty immediately resumed his position, his eyes locking back onto that ugly sheet of plywood. Sarah followed his gaze. To her, it was just wood and nails. But as she watched the unblinking focus of the cat, the plywood seemed to dissolve. She realized Rusty was not looking at the barrier. He was looking through it. In his mind, the window was clear. The fire was lit. And Joe was sitting in his chair. Rusty was not staring at an empty building. He was staring at the only life he knew, refusing to blink, lest it disappear forever. For the first time since she arrived, the business plan in Sarah's head went silent, replaced by the crushing realization of what loyalty truly looked like. Sarah unlocked the front door with a heavy iron key that felt like ice in her hand. The hinges groaned in protest as she pushed the heavy wood open, breaking the seal that had kept the house in suspended animation. The air inside was stale and cold, smelling of old paper and the lingering faint aroma of pipe tobacco. It was the scent of a life interrupted. Before Sarah could even reach for the light switch, a flash of orange fur darted between her boots. Rusty, who had been shivering on the porch moments before, moved with a sudden, desperate energy. He did not run to the kitchen where his food bowl used to be. He did not run to the radiator. He sprinted directly to the center of the living room and stopped before the stone fireplace. Sarah watched, bewildered, as the cat began to scratch frantically at a specific section of the oak floor. The sound of his claws raking against the varnished wood filled the silent room, a sharp, rhythmic rasping that echoed off the empty walls. He was digging as if his life depended on it, pausing only to look back at Sarah and let out a sharp, demanding cry. "He thinks there is a mouse," Sarah whispered to herself, stepping closer. But as she looked down, she saw that Rusty was not hunting. He was pressing his nose into the gap between the floorboards, inhaling deeply. He was seeking the one place in the house where Joe's scent was still concentrated, preserved in the darkness beneath the wood. Sarah remembered then, a vague memory from her last visit years ago, of her grandfather kneeling in this exact spot, laughing as he hid a treat for the cat. Curiosity overcame her impatience. She knelt beside Rusty, gently moving him aside. He resisted at first, but then sat back, watching her with those intense, golden eyes. Using the tip of a flathead screwdriver she had brought for the packing, Sarah wedged it under the loose piece of trim and leveraged it up. The wood popped free with a dry snap. There were no mouse nests underneath. There were no cat treats. Resting in the dusty cavity was a battered tin box, the kind usually used for holiday cookies. Sarah lifted it out. The metal was cold and heavy. Her hands trembled as she removed the lid. Inside, neatly stacked and bound with rubber bands, was a decade of silence. On top was a pair of unused baseball tickets for the Cleveland Guardians, dated July 2024. Beneath that, another pair from 2023 and 2022, going all the way back to the year she stopped coming home. Next to the tickets were envelopes addressed to her in Joe's shaky block handwriting. None of them had stamps. She opened the top one. "Dear Sarah," Joe had written, "bought us seats behind the dugout this year. I know you are busy with the big job in Chicago, but if you can get away, Rusty and I will be waiting on the porch. No pressure, kiddo. Love, Grandpa." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. Hot and fast, she looked at the stack of tickets. 10 summers of hope that she had unknowingly crushed with her absence. Joe had never told her. He had never made her feel guilty. He just bought the tickets, waited, and when she did not show, he placed them in this box and buried them, saving the disappointment for himself. Sarah looked at Rusty. The cat nudged her arm with his head, purring softly now that the box was found. She realized then that the cat had not been guarding a boarded-up building. He had been guarding this. He was the only witness to 10 years of lonely hope. The keeper of a love that had waited patiently beneath the floorboards. Sarah sat on the dusty floor for a long time, the tin box resting heavily in her lap. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was waiting. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket, the screen glowing bright in the dim room. Her thumb hovered over the contact for the real estate agent, but instead of confirming the listing, she dialed her boss in Chicago. "I need to make a change," she said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I can handle the accounts remotely. I am not coming back to the city. Not yet." Next, she called the nursing facility. The arrangements were canceled. Joe was coming home. For the next 3 days, the house on Elm Street underwent a transformation. The screech of screws being reversed filled the air as the heavy plywood sheets were taken down. One by one, light flooded back into the living room, revealing the dust motes dancing in the air. The old furnace in the basement, which had slept for weeks, roared back to life with a deep, rhythmic thrumming, sending the blue flame of warmth traveling through the pipes to every corner of the house. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle blanket of fresh snow. The streetlights of Youngstown hummed to life, illuminating a scene that looked like a painting from 1950. The house was no longer a dark fortress. Golden light spilled from every window, and a wreath of pine hung on the front door. A medical transport van pulled up to the curb. The lift lowered slowly, and Joe was wheeled out, wrapped in thick blankets. He looked frail, his face pale against the dark wool, but his eyes were sharp. He looked up at the house, expecting to see the boarded-up shell he had been told about. Instead, he saw life. His gaze drifted to the porch. There, sitting upright in its proper place, was his heavy oak rocking chair. It had been scrubbed clean and set exactly where he liked it, angled to catch the afternoon sun. "You fixed the chair," Joe whispered, his voice thick with emotion as Sarah wheeled him up the ramp. "I fixed a lot of things, Grandpa," Sarah replied softly. They entered the living room. The fire was crackling in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The smell of pipe tobacco and pine filled the air. And then there was a movement near the sofa. Rusty did not run this time. He did not hide. He walked with a regal, deliberate calm toward the wheelchair. He looked up at Joe, blinked his golden eyes, and then effortlessly leaped onto the old man's lap. Joe let out a shaky breath, his wrinkled hand coming down to rest on the cat's head. Rusty settled instantly, curling into a tight ball of orange fur, and a loud, rumbling purr filled the room, competing with the crackle of the fire. Sarah stood by the window, watching the snow fall on the quiet street. She touched the pocket of her cardigan, where the tin box of tickets was safely tucked away. She had come here to close a chapter, to sell a building, and move on. But looking at the old man and the cat who had refused to give up on him, she realized she had been the one who was lost. Thanks to the stubborn loyalty of a creature with sweaty paws and a brave heart, she had finally found her way home. Rusty showed us that loyalty is a language spoken without words, and that sometimes it takes the quiet persistence of a faithful friend to remind us that the most valuable things in life are not the houses we build, but the hearts we hold on to. If this story warmed your spirit tonight, we would be honored if you joined our growing Fearless Paws family by subscribing and sharing this tale with someone you love. We read every comment and would cherish hearing your own memories. And to continue our journey of heartwarming tales, simply click the video appearing on your screen right now.